hearing about S 127, the sections of the Senate Housing Bill that are related to our areas of jurisdiction with the Legislative Council who authored those sections. Welcome, John Gray.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to try to be as efficient as possible, just given time constraints. Looks like you guys can see this pretty clearly. So just high level, and then I'll jump to the area that's relevant to you guys. This is a project-based approach to tax increment financing. So unlike districts which contemplate a broad area in which you would have a bunch of projects arise, this is tied to a particular project. The goal behind this program, at least as stated in the purpose, is to stimulate the development of housing. So you're financing infrastructural improvements that would then stimulate the development of housing on a designated parcel. Would be much more geographically constrained than a TIF district, right? Which could be a quite broad swath. This would be wherever the housing development that is stimulated by the financing is set, the place at which that is constructed, and any immediately adjoining parcels would be your housing development site. And the reason that is relevant is.
I have a question about, is that the whole bill up there, or is that just?
This is just House Commerce's proposal related to from yesterday for the CHIP section. So this does contain the entirety of the CHIP subchapter. This is creating a new subchapter. But this is not the whole of S 127, which is a much larger.
Did you submit that to our?
That is posted on the page. So let's jump down to the actual application process. So page 7, you'll see the application that a municipality has to go through to pursue a project through this program. And there's sets of different criteria that an application has to meet to get into the door to have access to this kind of financing. And so VEPC, the Vermont Economic Progress Council, is the entity that reviews these applications. That's what currently happens for TIF districts. And they would review here specifically process requirements, a project criterion, which is tied to housing, and location criteria. So the location criteria are, I think, where the committee's interests lie. So I'll jump past the process requirements, but I can speak a little bit to the project criterion. This is not what came over in the bill as passed by the Senate, but this is the element of housing that is proposed in yesterday's draft from House Commerce. I can pause if you would like for me to describe what the Senate did, which is a relatively light project criterion. It just says the housing development has to include housing. And so you could meet that quite simply, right? The site where you're constructing a building or buildings to meet a criterion that just says includes housing, could literally offer one unit, and every other part of that building or construction could be something other than housing, and you would have satisfied that project criterion. So one of the primary goals that we've been tackling in House Commerce is how to boost up that housing piece. And so what you see here is a proposal that says the housing development plan, which is what describes the housing development that is to occur as part of this project, that at least 60% of the gross floor area of that projected housing development would be dedicated to housing. So it provides a threshold as to how much floor area would be dedicated to housing. There was an early concept on the Senate side that had a 50% threshold. And part of the discussion in the Senate was that folks might be at the margins and it might still be useful to get them through the door. So they in part backed away from having a threshold because they were concerned that folks might be close but not make it across the line. And so they ended up with just this broad includes housing language. What you see here is a 60% threshold requirement, but House Commerce has tried to take consideration of that concern that folks might not get in with housing that you do want to encourage. And so they've created this separate subdivision 2 on line 9 that allows a board that this program would stand up to make a determination that the projected housing development meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community. So basically, an application came through the door and didn't meet that 60% gross floor area requirement dedicated to housing, you could get a determination from this board to say, well, we still think, even though you're under that 60% determination, that this is a worthwhile project to pursue from a housing perspective. I can pause there, but the next thing is the biggest piece for you guys, I think. Did folks have questions on that?
Yeah. Do members have questions on this part of what we're talking about? I think I will have questions, but Representative Chapin.
just curious about why not just go with the second piece? And I guess I'm presuming it's because that board shouldn't need to meet when the majority of the project is housing.
Yep. This board is a new construct proposed by House Commerce, and all of TIF districts and this proposal run through VEPSI. That's the entity that is familiar with TIF, has rules in place, that knows how to administer the program. Obviously, this is a new program. This board is being stood up here, and this is just a 5-member board that doesn't regularly meet. So if you just had that other, you're basically replacing VEPSI with a new entity. And I don't think the intent is to have this board function as a huge component of the program. The thinking is that they would provide kind of one-off approvals as necessary. Although I did note to the committee yesterday, unlike TIF districts, which have an aggregate cap in place and a county level cap, so you can only have so many TIF districts in the state, there are no caps for projects under this program. So theoretically, you could have all kinds of project applications coming in, and many of those might not be meeting the 60% threshold, in which case this board could have a quite substantive duty on their hands. I also do just want to say I'm going to have to leave very shortly to run over to House Commerce. So if you had a question on this piece, I'm happy to address it, but it might be helpful for me to just have the location criteria in front of you so you can see the setup, and I'll frame what is coming this afternoon.
I just need a definition
Yes.
of
those.
gross floor
It
area.
would include things like basement and other levels, so not just your
Attic,
habitable levels,
basement, unusable spaces.
so
Great.
all floor area for the building, exactly.
Okay.
Location criteria. So as you'll know, for TIF districts, you can only situate TIF districts within particular areas. So this is the location-specific criteria for this project-based approach. What you will have seen in the Senate version, as passed by the Senate, contained 3 different location criteria here. You have to fit into one of these. And that included in your subdivision 1, an area designated tier 1A or tier 1B, or an area under the interim housing exemptions. It also included a subdivision 2, which is your tier 2, and it provided as a proxy until those tier 2 designations were available, that an RPC could write a letter essentially saying that the plan would conform with regional planning in the area. Lastly, there was this location criterion for existing settlements or areas within 1/2 mile. The draft from House Commerce yesterday removed tier 2. So you just have this tier 1A or tier 1B, or the interim housing exemptions or existing settlement. And I'm just going to say, and as soon as I walk over to the other room, there will be a new draft that reinstates tier 2, and which I could come back and speak about the approach to that, but just to forecast, it would be a delayed effectiveness. The availability of that location criteria wouldn't come until after the first tier 2 designation had been made a year prior. So it'd have to be a year following first tier 2 designation before that would even be available. And the thinking there is to allow people to actually have insight into what those areas are and see if they want that available and if you need to tweak things and make it constrained.
Has anyone made a map of the existing settlement areas with a 1/2 acre?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so where does that 1/2 mile, excuse me, 1/2 mile, just a random thing that someone pulled out of the air?
What I was told to drop down. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Do members have further questions? Representative Labor.
You said tier 2 was going to be delayed about a year.
We'll see what the approach is, but the concept I've been asked to draft is to have a delayed effective date for the location criterion for tier 2. And that delayed effectiveness would be 1 year following the first tier 2 designation. So there would be time to check in, basically, is the thinking.
I don't see the equity in that between, you're almost mandating one tier 1A and tier 1B to the bigger communities. By Burlington, Essex, or Middlebury, or towns of size. And I say this, I have 2 small communities that they have village water, village sewer, But they're under 1,200 residents. Consider that small. They wouldn't, they'd have to wait.
Conversations for you guys, yeah.
That's the end of that for me.
I mean, do you know if they're 1 acre or 10 acre Act 250 towns? You can be a small town and meet other criteria. It's not about the size of your town. It's about whether you have a town plan, a zoning bylaw, and a subdivision bylaw.
Have that information with me now.
Right, so if they are that, they can qualify. If they have water and sewer and all that, they qualify to be 1A if they want to.
RPCs. Up there, so.
Representative Chapin.
So if we include tier two, we're basically including virtually the whole state where you would put housing. So why
Yeah.
not just have TIF financing available for all housing in the state?
Yeah.
I think these questions for you guys, not for.
They are for us. And so just a little bit on process. The bill is in the possession right now of the Housing Committee in the House, Senate bill. It will, they have asked our Commerce Committee and us to weigh in on our particular areas of jurisdiction. And I guess I might remind the Commerce Committee that land use is our area of jurisdiction. And to the extent that this is overlapping, I understand. They can have an opinion, as then we can also have opinions on the housing portions of this bill. And that then our House Committee will take those under advisement. And then the bill will need to go to Ways and Means, where I strongly suspect they will put boundaries on the dollar amounts available for the program, though I can't speak for them. Not sure it would be responsible tax policy not to. So I would hope that they would do that. That's where we are right now in this process. And we are under no obligation to wait for the Commerce Committee to make a recommendation. I was curious where they were at in their conversation. And actually, I think we scheduled you to be here at this time right now. So I would just also say thank you for trying to accommodate both of us. Yeah, and we also need to get our decisions out. We're under the same time constraints that the Commerce Committee is.
What's our area of jurisdiction?
Land use in this particular instance.
But in this particular bill,
References to the tier 1A, if something is going to be driving development in a particular part of the state, that's land use.
So just because I do have to run, please do reach out for this afternoon. And I think I should be able to make it in. And you will have an updated draft at that point also.
Okay.
That does change this section.
All right. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, guys. See you soon.
I guess not sure. Why do we need attorneys in this committee? We can't seem to get them. All right. Maybe I'll welcome Mr. Groveman, his thoughts on where we are right now in this conversation.
Good morning. So for the record, I'm John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm really glad you're having this conversation. So this was an issue. One of VNRC's programs is our Sustainable Communities Programs, which is led by Katie Gallagher, and she's a professional planner. And she's on maternity leave. She had a baby like a month ago. But before she left, this was something that we were tracking, like the language around the use of these funds for housing. And when she left, she asked me to continue to track it. We ran out of time in the Senate. We didn't get to really testify on this. So I'm glad that it's being discussed now. And I think you've identified the issue is obvious, right? This is public money to promote housing. And we have always been concerned at VNRC about how we're using public money to encourage development and make sure it's the type of development that really the state wants to encourage, that is going to create smart growth communities and denser walkable communities and a more affordable housing. And, you know, housing could be built anywhere in tier 2, as you know, but this is about what are we encouraging with public money. And so Katie, you know, her opinion was we should really focus on the tier 1 areas. The tier 2 is, I think it was just stated, it's the whole, it's basically the whole state, there really aren't any constraints there. And when we're talking about public money, we should be judicious and, and I think the chair is right. When the tax committees look at this, because there is a real impact by not collecting taxes for this money. So it's a real benefit, but it also creates, a tax money that's not there for other programs.
But other people need to backfill.
Yeah.
These developments will need services that the towns will have to provide for them.
And as the
At cost.
As Ledge Council said, there's always been judiciousness with the TIF program. So we think it makes sense to start with the tier 1 areas. If there was a concern that was too constrained, and I would argue that we don't know yet. We haven't seen the maps, that we should see the maps. I just had this conversation before I came in the committee room. The maps are supposed to account for like new housing growth and housing needs. So we don't know that that's not going to be the case. I suspect that it will be the case that the maps will do that. So it seems to us, if you're going to really use public funds, you should focus on those areas and let's see what the maps look like. And then if people, after looking at the maps and seeing how this works, want to expand it, we could have that conversation. And if the expansion conversation occurred, our first recommendation would be maybe look at a half mile around those tier 1 areas. Existing settlement is an Act 250 term.
Excuse me, but the tier 1 A's and B's are areas that the communities are identifying for growth.
Right.
We keep adding these buffers around.
No, I'm saying like after you see, like, I wouldn't do that now, but after you see the maps, if the people feel that they're too constrained, that would be sort of, in our view, like the next step in the conversation. But not a half mile around existing settlements, which are, as an Act 250 term. It's really a term that's used if you propose a development, you have to show that either your project is in an existing settlement, and if it's not, that the cost of providing services to the project does not outweigh the benefits of the project. So that criteria is not designed as creating new neighborhoods, or that's not the point of that criteria. And to your point, Madam Chair, we don't know, you can't map those areas really ahead of time because it's case by case basis and it's really subjective. So I understand what they're trying to do by writing that term in. There's some decent smart growth language in the existing settlement criteria that talks about compact settlements and walkability, but it's very subjective and it would be on a case by case basis, and it's not clear, where those areas are and what areas would qualify. So yeah, I mean, I think I've said, I think you understand what the issue is, and I'm glad. I do think there needs to be these constraints, and it's concerning. It's really concerning if they're opening up to all of tier 2.
Yeah.
From our perspective.
I also think it's important to remind us all that this is proposed to go into effect now in the currently sort of with the interim exemption areas, which are pretty broad as well, right? So
right. They have some constraints that were put in, and those areas will dissolve, once we have the maps, and we won't need those interim exemption areas any longer. So yeah, I would urge you to stick with the 1A and 1B areas, remembering that we haven't seen the maps and they're supposed to include new areas, especially housing growth. That's the charge. So happy to answer any questions. But
Representative Chapin.
Just quickly, the timing on seeing the new maps?
So the timing is they're going to be developed this summer and start to be approved in the late fall, and they have to, I think by January 2026 they'll be approved. By the time you all get back, you'll see the maps. We are gearing up to review and comment on them, and I know the RPCs they're working very hard, and they have consistently said they're going to meet their deadline.
Representative Sakowitz, then Labor.
Yeah, I just happened to be at a planning commission meeting in Randolph last night where our RPC actually presented their draft map for Randolph.
Oh, yeah.
For future land use, and it was quite clear from the map that they gave, and they seemed to think that this was going to be applicable to other communities in the area as well, but that in our map, they were able to easily identify areas for future growth, which would which would accommodate future housing needs, over the next several years. And so, this idea that we would need tier two to accommodate, housing growth, that it's actually necessary to meet our housing needs would seem to be contraindicated by these maps.
Representative Labor,
I've already asked my question. One of the maps available.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'll pass.
Representative Levy.
I've got a number of questions. First is the housing needs. Who's deciding the housing need?
The RPC is based on, but the LURB ultimately, when they'll have to approve the maps, but the charge is, I forget to look at 20 years or something. Is that, I forget.
Well, I think it's the housing needs assessment.
Yeah.
It's allocated by town in a kind of interesting way, based on how much development you have today, which I find to be an odd way of allocating what each town's requirement for allowing housing into their town is. So
Allowing housing into the town. We're talking about housing and then we're talking about possibly allowing housing. I'm trying to figure out the
No.
wording here.
no, it's actually so the housing needs assessment identified what economic development folks think are the needs to house current and future Vermonters. And the way they're using it is dividing it up and telling towns like, you need to find a place for this many houses if you don't already have it.
But it's not mandated, right? It's a recommendation. They're saying, I know in Colchester, there's a low amount, you can go to your town. Or, you're kind of and look at the recommendations for low, medium, and high number of houses. That they're, I think, recommending.
I'm sure it's not mandated. You can't make a house appear by mandating it.
They were really clear last night that they're not talking about mandates, that it's really up to the individual communities to decide. And that, and just to remind us that this is all about where we want to encourage housing. It's not about where we're going to allow or not allow housing. It's where are we going to
Yep.
try and incentivize additional housing.
Couple more questions. What was it? Item number 2, I think it says something to the effect of a half-mile buffer around, I guess, a existing
settlement.
community. Okay. I can think of one of my towns where the existing settlement is subject to flooding. So if we were to take out that buffer, you would limit the ability of one of the settlements that I'm thinking of in my district to actually expand into a area of higher ground. And maybe if they chose to abandon the lower areas or find ways to buy out properties that are subject to flood at a slow rate so people don't feel like they were forced out. So I hope there is plan to leave that language in there.
Okay, like I said, existing settlements don't exist, like they don't really exist. So what, I gave you a real life example that I think addresses your concern. So I live in Marshfield, Vermont. And we were flooded out 2 years ago and Plainfield was flooded out last year. And Plainfield lost a number of houses. I'm sure you probably heard the story in last summer's flood. And they have been going through a process to identify an area to build the housing they lost outside of the floodplain and the river corridor. And the area is within the tier 1 mapping. It's like that's what they're proposing it to be, and the Regional Planning Commission has agreed. So the tier 1 map for Plainfield is going to include an area, just like you said, which is upland of the river corridor and the floodplain that would allow for dozens of new houses to be built. But that's in the mapped area. So I think the mapping is considering, what you're talking about. It was intended to do so. I think the mapping criteria basically directs the RPCs to consider staying away from river corridors and floodways, and in assessing the housing needs, factoring that you can't build and you shouldn't build, new housing in those areas. So, I mean, I guess that's consistent with my plea. Let's look at the maps. Like, I think when you see the maps from the Washington County RPC that includes Plainfield, you're going to see, oh, there's this whole area that is probably a half mile from downtown Plainfield by the river, but it's still within the growth area, still close enough to I don't know how familiar you are with Plainfield, but with the co-op, it's really near the co-op, which is, half mile from Route 2 or something like that, maybe a little bit more. But, and I think the community thinks that makes sense. And so, yeah, I would submit that I think the maps will factor that in, you know, and and the law already, as I said, accounts for we shouldn't be building in the flood areas any longer.
I have a couple more. These settlement areas, most of what I see in the language is referring to existing infrastructure, water and sewer. I don't have that in my districts. How is this going to encourage anything in my rural towns? I'm not seeing it. Without that tier two, which sounds like it would give more options.
The tier one areas allow for, this was a big debate last year, Madam Chair, and you could speak to it because it was a real focus issue about it was water or sewer or some soils, right? It wasn't just, it's not just
Soils,
hard infrastructure. So if you,
septic soils can be very subjective and it could be a lot of red tape.
So
That's why I'm
also,
worried.
just to be clear, we're not talking about funding private developers to stand up an entire sewer treatment facility. We're talking about helping developers extend a sewer line that's already in your town to a parcel. Right? We're not, and there are other things in there we should look at that would qualify for this financing, but this is not to pay for new sewer infrastructure in a town. Won't do it.
I'd also point out, this is consistent. There's a longstanding policy that the Agency of Natural Resources has about existing funding for infrastructure for water and sewer that is tied to these same smart growth principles. And that's been on the books probably for more than 2 decades. And it's served, I think, well, and it's the same principle that we have limited public money. And I think as the chair is saying, it's not that you can't build in these areas. Like how much, we have limited public money. So how are we going to prioritize where that money goes? And so you could ask the A&R people and bring them in. It's called the sewer rule. And I think it's been successful in helping the agency to identify, how to disperse that public money. And I think it would be helpful to the boards that are going to get applications for this funding to have those, priorities set, in the statute.
And that rule is under,
It's the Agency of Natural Resources.
I mean, like, is it applying to how we spend clean water revolving loan funds?
Yeah, it's mostly revolving loan funds. That's exactly.
Representative Austin, did you have a question?
No, thank you. Answered it.
Further questions? John Gray joined us again. They didn't need you in commerce.
Thank you for the time. This is really important. I'm glad you're
John Gray.
analyzing it.
Yeah, they did just email me to come back, but I'm here right now. Did anything come up in this intervening time that I can help you guys with? Because they can.
Well, I was thinking about the other sections of yellow in this that we didn't think we had time for. Running through these, so that's how they've changed them from the Senate proposal.
Okay. Just a second.
Or this first one, housing development definition. 60, yeah. There's a lot of questions.
I will screen share in a second, but I'm happy to start.
We're pretty used to just finding it on.
Oh, okay.
devices and walking.
That's great. Let's
Really see this.
So in 1.1, you're seeing at the bottom of page 1, your first highlighting. That's an update to the definition of housing development. This goes to what I was speaking about before, that the housing development as conceived in the Senate proposal was just about a building that contains housing. And so what you see reflected here is picking up that project criterion that we talked about, that either 60% of gross floor area dedicated to housing or that board determination that it meets the community needs for housing. So flow through change from the project criterion, but there is a substantive change here on page 2, the definition of improvements. Just to orient, improvements are what are covered by financing through tax increment financing. It's typically infrastructure. There's a slight different piece that I can talk about related to your debt service payments. But typically the way that we think about improvements is this is the infrastructure you're financing with the tax increment. What came across from the Senate was a slightly broader, and I would say only theoretically broader definition of improvements than exists for TIF districts. And so it just says the construction of infrastructure that meets a public good and satisfies the purpose of the subchapter. And then it provides a laundry list of things that are included as items of infrastructure. In the Senate version, this was a quite lengthy list that captured everything for TIF districts and added a few pieces like digital infrastructure. It explicitly called out parking because TIF districts has a definition for improvements that includes public facilities, which conceivably could be parking. But the intent in the Senate language was that it could pick up private parking. So improvements could be private pieces under the Senate proposal. And the thinking there was you might have something like you need a parking lot for the housing development that you're doing, and that parking lot might be private, right? It's specific to that piece. So I would just characterize the Senate definition of improvements, which is your classic infrastructure, as a slightly broader list than what exists for TIF districts. And what you see here is the approach taken yesterday. This will change, but the approach taken yesterday for improvements was to not have a broad thing, the construction of infrastructure, and then provide a laundry list of inclusive items, right? Because that doesn't exhaust the category. It just tells you things that we take to be, that we designate as infrastructure. To back away from providing a general concept and to actually spell out every permissible use that you could finance. So it was an attempt to get at an exhaustive list of coverable expenses, basically. And here what you see are trying to get at classic infrastructural costs that you might think would be necessary to stimulate housing development. So at the bottom of that page 2, construction of power or telecommunications infrastructure, wastewater, stormwater, water dispersal, water collection, water treatment facilities and equipment, public roads, streets, bridges, multimodal facilities, public transit, sidewalks, sidewalk lighting, these sorts of things. So an attempt to provide an exhaustive list, and I would just call out these sets of examples were drawn from the 2015 TIF rules that BEPC has in place. It's ever so slightly narrowed down from what's there, but conceptually the approach is not to provide a broad bucket, but to exhaustively list the things that you want to finance with tax increment financing.
Let's ask a question. What does water dispersal mean?
You would have to talk to, this is what is BEPC uses for their TIF rules. So I think those folks would have some sense as to how they.
I mean, stormwater is separately listed. I don't know. Yeah, okay.
And I will just say they backed away from this, but I completely agree that if you're providing an exhaustive list, tightening up what you're actually doing and calling out all the things that you want to capture is the way to do this. And this is, yes, this could be improved if people want to do this concept of an exhaustive list.
Okay, thank you. We can move on.
On page 3, you're going to see site preparation for development or redevelopment, including land and property acquisition, demolition, brownfield remediation, or flood remediation mitigation. This, except for the flood remediation and mitigation language, is what is in place for TIF districts. So this is currently permissible for TIF districts across the state. You can engage in site preparation, you can acquire land. The flood remediation and mitigation language is a new addition, and that did come over from the Senate.
Okay, thank you.
Can jump down to page 8 is where we were talking before. These were the updates to the project criterion. I'm happy to talk about these again, but maybe we can keep flipping through just to other highlighted text. We talked about the location. Let's jump to the bottom of page 13. This is your section 1910C, use of tax increment retention period. So as you know, for the tax increment financing construct, the idea is that you retain that tax increment over a particular defined period, and you're retaining only a particular percentage of that tax increment, right? A remaining piece is going to the ed fund. So what's currently in place on the books for TIF districts is that up to 70% of that statewide education property tax, you can retain up to 70%, but that other 30% goes up to the ed fund, right? So these percentages really matter in terms of their impacts on the ed fund. The version that came across from the Senate, I believe, included an up to 80%. So the municipalities could retain a significantly larger increment, a percentage of that increment that they've generated. So this is dropping it down to that 70% figure to match what is in place for TIF districts. And similarly, on page 14, the municipal property tax increment for, as you'll know, there's two taxes here, right? There's the statewide property tax and there's the municipal property tax. And so you're retaining the increment in each. We, have VEPSI set up. We have this whole program apparatus to really get at the statewide component, right? Less so the municipal piece, but we do still spell out an amount for the municipal property tax increment. And so what is on the books for TIF districts is what you see here from yesterday. That's not less than 85%. What came from the Senate was not less than 100. So you would have to use the entirety of your municipal tax increment toward the project. And there would be some kind of knock-on effects that are a little bit unfortunate. Like we contemplate that related costs, which is we typically think of improvements as the primary thing that you finance through tax increment financing, but you can also cover related costs, which are things like the personnel that you need to run the program or set up the applications and the like. You can cover those costs too, but you can only cover them if you have an extra municipal increment. So if you used 100% toward these other pieces, you wouldn't have that available. So this is dropping these percentages from what was received in the Senate to match what is on the books for TIF districts, which is up to 70% the statewide education property tax and no less than 85% of that municipal. They could elect to use more if they want to. And the way that I typically conceptually think about the municipal property tax increment, why it's higher and why it's a not less than, as opposed to an up to, is that you're trying to ensure that municipalities are putting forth a good faith effort, basically, right? They're contributing as much of that extra increment as you're doing on the statewide level. And in this case, you're prescribing more than that statewide piece. You've got to contribute a substantial portion of that increment to your financing. There is a pretty meaningful change further down on page 14, subsection D. So you see excess tax increment. To call out what this is, in any year, you're generating this increment right if your property values have risen within the designated geographic area. So that would be the district for a TIF district. And in this concept, it would be your housing development site. So that's what your increment is, the taxes, that extra property value that you've risen over time. But it's possible that in a given year, you've only committed a certain amount to your financing and you actually receive excess increment. So you have this extra money on hand that isn't committed to your bond payment. And what do you do with that extra money? What happens for TIF districts and the standard mechanics that were in here until this draft came out yesterday? So what was received from the House? There are mechanics to allow municipalities to prepay financing, to put it aside in a special account to hold for future financing if they wanted to pursue future lines of financing, so take out additional loans. And then lastly, if they were going to incur like a prepayment, something like this, basically, if they were going to incur a prepayment penalty, which is something that can happen under certain contracts, you could essentially on the books say that you have the cash on hand because you've generated this excess tax increment and lower on your books what it looks like you're actually paying on the fund. So defeasance is what we call that. Those are the standard mechanics that we have in place for TIF districts. That's what came over for the Senate. This is a narrowing of what can be done with the excess tax increments. And the reason this matters is this tells you when extra money flows up to the ed fund, right? Because if you have extra, that could go up to the ed fund and not be held there. And so what you see here is a proposal to eliminate those prepaying financing, putting in a special account, all of those pieces, and saying all that you can do, and I'll just read it, of that municipal and education property tax increment received in any tax year that exceed the amounts committed for the payment. So that's the concept we were just talking about. Up to 30% may be retained to place an account and used to offset the payment of financing and related costs if you have a down year, basically, in any year in which no tax increment is generated, provided that at the end of your period, you still have this piece, it would flow up to the ed fund. So the idea here is you're not holding on to a bunch of extra funds if this happens. you could only hold on to 30% of that excess. And the only uses to which you could put it are if you had property value declines, and that would be available. So this is a narrowing of the excess tax increments with the intent that in your below the unhighlighted text in subdivision 2, you'd have a greater remaining portion of the excess that would be distributed to the ed fund. That's the thinking behind this section.
Representative Austin, I don't want to go too far in the weeds, but go ahead.
Yeah. So TIFs have been around for a while. What is the likelihood or what is the data on municipalities having no tax increment generated?
I'm sorry, can you maybe rephrase that? I'm not following the.
Where it says used to offset the payment of financing related to costs in
Yep.
any year in which no tax increment is generated. Is that often or is that
Oh.
unusual? Or
I
what?
think it is unusual. I wouldn't be the one to speak to empirics, but the only way in this that this could conceivably happen is if the property value in the geographically designated area, so here the housing development site has declined.
Yeah.
I think the instances in which it might happen are early years, right? Like in your early years when you're undertaking to develop the property and you haven't yet benefited from the development that you're doing, it's theoretically possible. But I should just offer from a not like the whole philosophical justification behind doing TIF is that you've stimulated development and increased property values. Something just policy-wise to be aware of in this proposal and in TIF districts broadly is there are provisions included to ensure that you make the ed fund whole as to the taxes on the original taxable value, regardless of what happens with the property value of the housing development site or the district. So if those declined, the muni is still obligated to fully fund the ed fund to the extent of the taxes on its original taxable value. And it's just in a bad position is basically what happens so I don't think, but it would be helpful to talk to VEPC or folks who have monitored this too. Other pieces relate to information reporting. So the information reporting section starts on page 15. And there's sets of different reports required here, just high level. The Muni will have to provide reports to VEPC and the Department of Taxes that set out the particular project that they're doing. And there's basically a funnel of information. VEPC would receive this information and they'll submit kind of an aggregated report, a yearly check-in to the legislature. And so that's what you're seeing at the very bottom of page 15. That's subsection B, annually on or before April 1 for Economic Progress Council and the Department of Taxes to submit a report to Senate Economic Development and on Finance and the House Committees on Commerce and Economic Development and on Ways and Means on housing infrastructure projects approved pursuant to the subchapter. Broadly, the set of information that's provided here, and I'll walk through it, aligns with the sets of information reporting that are required for TIF districts. So this is not, aside from the highlighted language you see here, very novel. There's a couple of tweaks for just definitional changes, but this is the kind of information reporting you're currently getting for TIF districts. So things like when was that project approved, description of the project, the original taxable value, the scope and value of the projected and actual improvements, including the number of housing units created. That is a substantive specific to this project-based approach that's about getting at housing. So trying to capture how much housing are you actually getting from the program. The new pieces you see on lines 5 and 6, the expected or actual sale and rental prices and the number of housing units known to be occupied on a basis other than its primary residence. So trying to get some information gathering on what's happening with the housing, what's it priced at, and are these becoming second homes or are they becoming investment property? I would describe what you see in subdivision 6 as a light touch to try to get at primary residence. It's just a reporting requirement. And you'll note that there's a mental state required here, right? The known to be occupied. This doesn't obligate the municipality to go out and discover this information. It just says if the municipality knows that it's not occupied as a primary residence, they would have to provide that information. So very light-handed touch to get at primary residence. And I'll just call out when you look through the draft, if you look to the purpose section of this subchapter, it speaks to the purpose being to stimulate the development of primary residences for low to moderate income. That's the sole reference to primary residence in the, there's no substantive piece that is achieving that. This is just the information reporting piece that speaks to that. Other pieces of your information reporting would be the number and types of housing units for, and this would be directly relevant to you guys, the number and types of housing units for which a permit is being pursued. And for each applicable housing development, the current stage of the permitting process. I know that folks who would be administering the program will have questions about the burden of undertaking this, but this is one I would call out as distinctively you guys' area. Subdivision 7, line 14 on page 16. Additional pieces of information would be that projected and actual incremental revenues, allocation of the incremental revenue. So what is it going to? Is it financing the improvements? And what you see here is just making clear it needs to call out how much is allocated to related costs, which are those, setting up the program, the municipal expenses, the personnel expenses, and the like. Also would include projected and actual financing. So that would be the annual report that comes from Betsy and Tax.
Sorry.
The-
You're continuing to interrupt us. And so here we are. Let's just keep going.
Okay. So that's your annual report that is happening on page 18. I'm going to see if it's worth calling out on page 17. This isn't highlighted, but just so you know from the Senate what came across. The idea is in the project application section, there's effectively a sunsetting that happens because it calls out a final application date. And that final application date is December 31, 2035. So the idea is that this is a 10-year program. You can take a look at it and basically see how this thing went. And that's what you're seeing on page 17 is that in the legislative session preceding that final application date, so January 15th, 2035. So the legislative session preceding the end of 2035, Pepsi would submit a report basically evaluating the success of the program in achieving its purpose. We just talked about that's stimulating the development of primary residences for low to moderate income. And it would identify things like the amount of and kinds of housing produced, and asking whether they had successfully met the criteria and criteria. So a 10-year check-in on how the programs went. And the other way to think about sunsets, I don't think I have to say for you guys, I'm sure that you encounter this, it's a chance to check in. You can repeal the repeal, right? You can repeal the cutoff date. It's just saying, it's forcing eyes to look at this. I think that, we do, okay. Something that we talked about before, only in passing, on page 19.
So actually, I think it might help you to know that Commerce has also rescinded the request, right?
Okay. That's great. That's great. The number of ways in which this is being communicated to me is impossible to navigate. Yeah. But then that is helpful. Yeah.
Let's all just focus on this and we'll get through it.
I'm like getting texts, but I'm not looking at my phone.
Okay. Right. Let's help you stay focused.
So I spoke before about the project criterion, the housing piece, and I spoke about how it had those dual tracks, which were unlike the centered approach, right? You could have that 60% gross floor area dedicated to housing, or you could have that board determination that you're meeting the community needs, the community housing needs, basically. So what you see on page 19 is this new board being stood up. So the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board, this would be created to assist Pepsi with evaluating just that particular criterion. That's the sole extent of the input they have on this program. The membership would be the state treasurer, the executive director of VHFA, the CEO of VITA, executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank, and the executive director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. And the duties would be exactly what we just spoke about upon request. So VEPSI has to make this request to them. The board would evaluate that housing development plan to determine whether the proposed housing development will meaningfully serve the housing needs of the community. And it's quite general language, right? It doesn't specify, you could offer a broad construct like this and say, to evaluate this, look to these factors, look to the statewide housing needs assessment, or, right, you could build this out in more ways. But the concept here is that they would make this determination to allow someone to get in under that 60% threshold. The remaining provisions are just, relatively technical, to have administrative and technical assistance, depending on where this is housed. Board would meet only upon request. It's not a standing committee. But as I talked about when I was in here earlier, we don't know how many applications are going to be submitted under this program. And in the absence of any caps, and if the program achieves the asserted reasons for doing this, which is to make this much more broadly available to all kinds of municipalities, you might expect, right, high numbers of applications, just depending on what folks are being able to do. But I think there's a real administrative question as to how, right, if these guys are being called back every week, that's, I think, not what is being envisioned here. So something to think about, just what the scope of the program is going to end up being. Standard per diems, and then the last piece you see in subsection D, decisions not subject to review. This is language that mirrors exactly what is in place for VEPC's approval of applications for TIP districts. So decision, not an administrative decision, subject to contested case hearings, not subject to judicial review. So this is a way of not, this is paralleling what is in place for TIF districts so that folks aren't litigating this particular decision. And as I say, I did not create this. I just pulled this directly from what VEPC currently has the authority to do.
Thank you.
Sure. And I can jump back to other pieces of the draft if it's helpful to kind of high level walk through the whole scope of the program, how it compares against TIF districts. Typically, when I've walked through in committees, I have tried to draw out the ways in which it is different from TIF districts, because the way that this was drafted was trying to pull many of the provisions that exist there, but slimming them down so that it's administratively simpler for municipalities to pursue, and also trying to correct a lot of the really problematic drafting on the books for TIF districts, which is that you have to look across multiple titles, and it's very difficult to understand what's going on there. So if folks want me to just speak about how this works, or if you have areas you would like for me to talk about what's going on, I can try to.
We'll open it up for questions. My first question is just directing us to the report that of current TIFs. What is it called?
Oh, I can probably send a link to this. I was just looking at these yesterday. It's just the VEPC annual reports, and I will very shortly have a link to send around. If I get any Wi-Fi.
Members have questions for Mr. Gray?
I just would like that link once again.
Yeah, he's about to send it.
Right now. Let's see.
Whenever.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We'll probably be asking to see you again, but.
Okay. The other thing I would offer, because I recognize that you guys may be less familiar, although honestly, oftentimes people who think they are familiar aren't familiar with how districts work. If this is an overwhelming amount of information and it's helpful for me to sit down with people individually, I'm happy to do that. So just, yeah.
Yeah, well, as a body, it's important for us all to understand the concepts of TIF.
Yes.
How much time we spend actually as a committee on it will vary depending on what we hear back from folks in the room. But thank you so much for sharing this with us. And, I expect that we're going to have our own recommendations. I don't know if it'll come in the form of an amendment, but we
Sure.
may have an amendment also.
Let's see. The other thing I would offer, if after the weekend you guys have thoughts, I'm happy to meet with people on Monday. I can just let me know what information you need from me, and I will help you.
Thank you so much. Well, do members have further questions for council while he's here? Not seeing any. It's bumped way into the lunch hour. So